All right. Hello, everyone. Last week we discussed how the federal Homeland Security enterprise was organized and kind of examined it from a couple different perspectives. This week we're going to be discussing how the state and local Homeland Security enterprise is organized. All right, so there's four readings for this week. The Martin chapter, very similar to the one from last week, just kind of gives a nice outline of how it's organized, how it's supposed to work. And it's much more of kind of this generic discussion. So I'm not going to spend any time on that in this video. But here I'm going to talk about the Lee article, the Chenoweth and Clark, and Burris, Giblin, and Schaefer. All right, so let's start with Lee. All right, so the Lee article discusses kind of whether or not community policing is a relevant policing strategy when you talk about policing in a homeland security context. Article's dated again, but it really explored kind of whether community policing was a legitimate form of policing that can survive and be integrated into homeland security policing. So a little bit of background. So the main push within policing prior to 9/11 was community policing. There were large amounts of federal grant money that were awarded uh, to many departments across the country um, for community policing. Um, But one of the issues with those disbursements was there really wasn't um, like this sort of measurable standards that were included with the disbursements for what community policing was actually supposed to look like. Okay, it was just this money, like, hey, do community policings, and organizations took it, and like, yeah, we're going to do community policing. Um, so there was a lot of money available, but not a lot of guidance as to what actually had to be done with it. Um, so after 9/11, you had kind of a similar thing happen with this uh, the grant money um, that was awarded for departments um, to kind of change this whole new kind of homeland security kind of look and kind of pushed away from this kind of community policing style to more this kind of legalistic style that was less interested um, in kind of the public satisfaction of community policing and the service function, more in favor of kind of this crime control and security function. So they did this in conjunction with kind of the this new intelligence, the new counterterrorism, and all the equipment they were given to um, state and local police agencies. And also prior to 9/11, there really wasn't any focus on the local level on terrorism. Now, I'm sure in some of the bigger cities there was some talk about it, but kind of as a general rule, kind of across the board, there was very little discussion of terrorism. So the initial view of Homeland Security policing was that it was kind of this return to the professional model that was developed by Vollmer a long time ago. It stated that police are going to be or should be agents of crime control, and that citizens were not really looked favorably upon, and certainly were not viewed as partners. Um, and there are certainly some instances where policing programs did move away from community policing, but I think um, a great many agencies did find a way to incorporate community policing within their homeland security responsibilities. And that's kind of the point that Lee makes here too. He kind of questions whether or not that's going to happen, but I think we've seen that there really hasn't been this big push away from community policing in favor of this more homeland security, um, kind of crime control type of policing. I mean, because really think about it, like what better way to find out what's going on in the community, as far as terrorism, extremism, than to have these partnerships throughout the community that the police work with. And also, kind of the last couple of years, there's been this increased focus on community policing that has really kind of brought this issue kind of to the forefront. All right, so that's Lee. Next article is Chenoweth and Clark. Now, their article discusses issues related to the coordination between the federal government and local governments related to homeland security functions. So they discuss three main factors um, that contribute to local performance and homeland security, oftentimes less than optimal local performance, things like insufficient resources, incomplete institutional ties, and weak governance arrangements. If you think about resources, like a common response of government to the implementation of anything, or especially problems with implementation, just throw more money at it, right? Um, that's always kind of the first thing. Well, we need more money, right? Throw more money at it. But is that really increasing effectiveness, or is that just simply throwing more money at stuff? Kind of secondly, um, well, our local government's kind of part of this decentralized government system that we have in the United States. It's hierarchical, but it's very decentralized. Um, so how those local governments are organized and how they're nested within that overall structure varies, and it can really play a role in how well local governments participate in homeland security and how well they're coordinated. And then finally, public-private partnerships are vital for homeland security. Many of these partnerships are at the local level. So, kind of how strongly or how weakly these arrangements, these coalitions, how those are formed at the local level really has a large impact on Homeland Security policy implementation and Homeland Security readiness. So they tested how well all three of those factors interact or impact interoperability of the Homeland Security functions. So they found that those with what they define as mature governance structures, those are structures that have decision-making groups, they have explicit agreements, they have evidence of strategic planning, funding specific to interoperability, strong leadership. Those were more likely to have high levels of interoperability, while those who were less mature were less likely, and this was regardless of how much grant money they had been awarded. So this really tested that. Does more money matter? Okay. They also found that cities that had nested government arrangements and things were tightly coupled had much higher or had higher scores of interoperability. Now, when they looked at nested government and the amount of coupling separately, neither one of those by themselves were enough to create these high levels of interoperability. So, kind of in conclusion, they found that coordination is very important, and resources were not enough to resolve coordination problems. Local places that had governance arrangements with nested institutions and these highly coupled, well-established partnerships with former rules were much more likely to have high levels of interoperability. So, really, in essence, this is how well the local government is structured and coordinated is more important than simply throwing money at the problem, because that in and of itself does not and will not solve it. So, still, these are issues that still are at play today. This article has implications today, really, regarding the interoperability of local government and their role in homeland security. All right, so the final article is Burris, Giblin, and Schaefer, and they examined homeland security preparedness through the lens of three organizational theories: contingency theory, resource dependence theory, and institutional theory. Those of you that have had CRM 715 are familiar with these kind of theories, but just kind of real quickly, contingency theory suggests, at least in a homeland security context, that homeland security preparedness is a rational response to threats, and the individual agency characteristics. So these agencies organize themselves and create policy and procedures based on not only how are they structured, but what are the threats that we're facing. So they react to things and they make changes based on those threats or contingencies. So now the number of possible contingencies is really endless. But this main thought is that agencies will identify these threats and then make whatever changes are needed to address those threats. Resource dependency theory emphasizes interorganizational power relationships and the need for resources. So organizations have to acquire outside resources, so then therefore, at least to some degree, are dependent on those outside sources. Okay, and when you have outside sources, you can then exercise, or those outside sources then exercise power over those organizations and require them to do certain things as a requirement for providing those resources. So a good example of this is the prevalence of community policing in the 80s and 90s. So agencies got that money and then implemented community policing to various degrees, whether or not they really wanted to, um, but they had to because of the money. So these organizations had the money, and they said, "We'll give you this as long as you do these things." Okay, so kind of the same thing happens at Homeland Security. With all the grant money available, um, this certainly could have an impact on local organizations. Then the final is institutional theory. So this theory suggests that organizational behavior is a reflection of expectations about appropriate behavior rather than rational responses to the environment. So essentially, organizations will organize themselves and act in a certain manner because of the expectations that an agency of their type will act a certain way. So their outside environment says you have to act this certain way. So then these agencies all kind of form themselves and interact and create these behaviors that are acceptable in this larger environment. This is really, really common within criminal justice organizations, but certainly can apply in a homeland security context as well. So when they did their study, they really didn't find that agencies were simply responding to perceived threats, which is contingency theory, or simply to monetary incentives, resource dependency theory. But they did find support for the effects of institutional theory, and that agencies were responding to these outside influences that were bringing new ideas or what was considered to be the latest kind of institutional processes, the latest accepted behaviors related to homeland security. All right, on that note, I'm going to stop for this week. Be sure you do all your assignments. And as always, if you have questions, let me know. And I'll see you next week.